Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 149. Today's guest is José Pablo Iriarte. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. For today's episode, I'm talking with my friend, writer José Pablo Iriarte. José Pablo Iriarte is a Cuban-American writer, high school math teacher, and parent of two. Their fiction has been a finalist for the Nebula, Hugo, Locus, and Sturgeon Awards, longlisted for the Otherwise Award, and reprinted in various Year's Best compilations. Their debut novel, Benny Ramirez and the Nearly Departed, will be published on April 30th, 2024 by Knopf Books for Young Readers, an imprint of Random House. Learn more at www.labyrinthrat.com or follow Jose on Facebook, Twitter, or Blue Sky at Labyrinthrat. Now, longtime listeners may remember that Jose was a guest back in the first year of the show, back in 2016, and we talked about their short fiction, which I am a big fan of. And now that their middle grade novel, Benny Ramirez and the Nearly Departed, is about to be published, I'm just so happy to have them back on the show to talk about their first book. The book is a delightful coming-of-age story in which the title character, Benny, has just moved from California to Florida, moving into his late grandfather's mansion and starting at a new school that his parents will be working at, which is a stressful enough situation for a kid. But then Benny is visited by his grandfather's ghost, a man who was a famous musician, but not a great guy or family man, and he needs help settling his unfinished business so he can move on to the afterlife. It's a sweet and funny story about self-discovery and family, and I'm just really happy that it exists. I've put links in the show notes to where you can pre-order copies of Benny Ramirez and the Nearly Departed from bookshop.org and from bookstores here in San Diego and in Kissimmee, Florida. As always, though, if there is an independent bookstore in your community, I highly recommend supporting that local business and ordering from there. One more thing before we get started. If you're enjoying this show, I hope you'll help support it by sharing it with the podcast lovers in your life or by leaving a review in your favorite podcast app. You can also financially support the show by making a monthly pledge via our Patreon campaign. At the $2 level and above, you get access to the bonus audio archive, which includes bonus readings from past guests like Luther Hughes, Liz Lenz, Ada Limon, and many more, as well as monthly mini episodes where I discuss different art and literature topics that have been on my mind. This month's mini episode is all about genre, what it is, what it does, and why it's such a fascinating thing to argue about. You can find all of that at patreon.com/likewisemedia. I hope you'll check it out. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with José Pablo Iriarte. I'm really happy to be able to, for one thing, I'm just really happy for you that your first book is coming out. I know you've been, publishing short stories for a long time now. As we were talking about in the pre-show, you were one of the early guests on this show. And that was 8 years ago now, but it's got to be kind of a different experience having a novel come out. And I guess I wanted to sort of start there. Like, what's the experience been like for you?
It's very exciting. We're in the last month now before the book comes out, and it's starting to become stressful in a way that it hasn't been, just where I'm conscious of all of the things that I should theoretically be trying to do to get the word out. And on an intellectual level, I'm aware that anything I do is unlikely to move the needle in an epic sense, but it still feels like if I don't reach out to the local media, then I've dropped the ball. If I don't reach out to local bookstores, then I've dropped the ball. If I don't get my event planned, all that sort of thing. So now I'm starting to hit the point where it just feels like there's more to be done than I can do, which that part's just true. But I probably have an inaccurate sense of how much it matters. But on the other hand, it's mostly cool that my writing is now real for people in a way that it never has been before. And really just in the last few days, just in the last week, because I've started to push out announcements about the book launch and things like that. And suddenly it's, oh, holy crap, Joe's gonna be a published author. I've been a published author for 11 years, but yeah.
It does. It does seem like there is something different about having a book you can hold in your hands.
Yeah.
But I think another thing that I was thinking a lot about is because, I'm a fan of your short fiction. Some of your stories have been ones that I still think about, even years later.
Thank you.
But this book is obviously very different in a number of ways from your short fiction. And, the biggest thing for me, the sort of most immediate thing that jumps out is that this is a book that's for young readers. It's a middle grade novel. I'm not sure exactly how middle grade gets defined, like what the sort of target age range is for readers, but, it's younger kids, right? Whereas, most of the short stories that I've read of yours have been, pretty clearly meant for adult readers. And the experience for me as the reader of reading these, this book versus your previous stories, there is a difference. But I also was really kind of curious for you how that difference manifests as a writer. Like, what are the different considerations that you're taking into account when you're writing for young readers versus writing for adults?
Well, on a superficial level, I don't think it's a young reader versus adult reader thing, but a big difference between this project and anything else that I've worked on before, or most things that I've worked on before, is that I tried to be funny in this, which is I wouldn't describe myself as funny usually. So that's something I was leaning into and going for, and people seem to respond. At the purchasing the book stage, people responded very favorably to that. And so I was like, oh, this is something I should have leaned into before. Yeah. As far as writing, Proof by Induction is probably the most grown-up thing I've written, but a lot of my short stories do feature teenage protagonists. And I thought of myself as a young adult writer for most of my career. The novels that I've written that did not get sold and published were young adult novels. And many of my short stories, like Substance of My Lives, feature teenage protagonists. I do have one short story that I think is in a middle grade space, although it doesn't have a similar voice to this one because it's not going for funny, but Secrets and Things We Don't Say Out Loud. That story I think of as basically kind of a middle grade story, even though it's a very different story tone wise. It's not going for humor the way that this story is. There's the big obvious things like you can't curse or drop the F-bomb. And the other thing that I was very conscious of in this, as opposed to a more young adult content, is I wanted Benny's family to not be toxic, other than his grandfather, but I wanted everybody else to really love each other, and their parents were good parents, fundamentally good parents. I think that's generally a thing that you see more in middle grade, is the parents are not the villains. But also, just on a personal note, I wanted Benny and his siblings to really have each other's backs.
And that's something I think that really comes through in this story. And it was something that I was thinking about, that not only are the parents not antagonists and the siblings are not antagonists, there really isn't what you would call an antagonist at all in the story. And in some ways, I guess it sort of depends on what your definition of conflict is. But, I think that a lot of things that we're taught when we're, especially sort of in an introductory kind of writing class, what we're taught, like in high school or whatever, is that conflict is the sort of thing that drives the plot of a story. Mm-hmm. And it's not that there are no instances of interpersonal conflict in this book. There are. There are places where there are friction between the characters. There might be hurt feelings or things like that, arguments. But it doesn't seem to me, at least, that conflict is what drives the plot of the story. And to me, that felt like a very purposeful kind of thing. So I wanted to sort of get your thoughts about how do we build a story where we're not centering some kind of a conflict as a plot driver. Or maybe, maybe that's not how you think about this story. So I guess that could be interesting too.
Actually, I think that you've kind of touched on if there is a Jose Iriarte trademark, I think that's it. When you look at my stories that are out there, they generally don't tend to. I'm thinking of like Life in Stone, Glass, and Plastic or Spirit of Home. It's really about characters confronting the things that they are most afraid might be true, and kind of being forced by circumstances to face that. So in Proof by Induction, Polly fears that he can never be good enough for his father, and he's got to confront that. And in Spirit of Home, I guess Tina is trying to. I guess she fears that that she can't be good at navigating the space between her heritage and her contemporary life, and she can't figure out who she is, what her identity is, and she has to confront that. And I think Benny, his fear is that he is the untalented Ramirez, and he's surrounded by talented people, not just in his family, but now in this school. And he's going to have to confront that. And his grandfather's presence just makes everything worse, because his grandfather is not saying to him, no, you're good enough. He's saying, I'm going to help you. I'm going to make you good enough, which really is a confirmation of everything that Benny fears. So I think my stories, they almost never have an antagonist. And I think that's something I backed into. That's not something I set out to do. And I think it has made my work harder to sell, because I think editors are looking for something a little bit more familiar a lot of the times. But when I have sold stories and they've found their audience, I think I've been very fortunate that that has made some people really appreciative of my stories, because that's their thing.
Do you feel like that's something that's particular to, like, I mean, you just said that you sort of think of your stories as being more YA, and with a couple of exceptions, including this one being more middle grade. Do you feel like that is something that's particular to like a certain segment of fiction, or that maybe it's something that's sort of changing overall? I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking of as you're talking is Becky Chambers's work. Mm-hmm. Which I remember a couple years ago when I read the first book of hers that I read was A Psalm for the Wild-Built. And right, yeah. And I remember when I posted a picture, because like I post a picture of all the books that I read to social media, mm-hmm. That you had responded to that post saying something along the lines of that book had sort of challenged your preconceptions of how fiction works, or something like that.
But in a good way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that, particularly with that little duology, but really all of Becky Chambers' work, it's similarly, there isn't really an antagonist to the stories. Right. So, like, I guess I wonder, well, one, like, if you wanted to expand on like that preconceived notion thing, but also just in general, like, do you feel like this is something that maybe we're coming around on, or do you think it's maybe something more pronounced in different sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, market segments or genres?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do definitely see in my social media circles an increased appreciation for stories that are not high tension, or stories that don't feature a villain. And I think that 5-10 years ago, you wouldn't have heard anybody articulating that, or they would have received a lot more pushback, because certainly every writing workshop, seminar, everything I ever went to, the insistence was that you have to have tension on every page, and that it's conflict that drives the story forward. So yeah, the fact that we hear these conversations, not just between you and me, but just around, is new, and that is definitely a sign of something that's changing. Market segment wise, that's an interesting question. I have a feeling that maybe, and I haven't, this is a not thoroughly thought out answer, but I have a feeling that maybe young adult is more open to that, or always has been, because so many young adult stories, or so many of the most powerful young adult stories, are about identity and figuring out who you are. And you can do that while fighting against a villain, but some stories, they're really just about that exploration.
Mm. This thing that you just said about, stories about young people so often being about identity. One of the things that I was thinking about with this book is that, it's very clearly a coming of age story for the title character, for Benny. In some ways, I think you could argue that it's also a coming of age story for Ignacio, for his grandfather, which is a little bit, I think there's something interesting about a coming of age story for a character who's already dead. But there is something that is so sort of timeless about that story structure, about the idea of, a Bill Douglas, I don't know how you say that word.
Yeah.
That I think in some ways we'll probably, as not just as a society or as a culture, but just as humanity in general, will probably never get tired of stories like that. But I did kind of wonder, what is it about that story structure that is attractive to you? Because like you were saying, I think that there are elements of some of your other stories that do a similar thing, like that story that you mentioned, Spirit of Home, which I love. I actually, I featured it on my other podcast when I was doing the short fiction show. And
I love the artwork and the recording.
Oh, thank you. I was really lucky with the artist that I found for that show. But, that story is in many ways, a coming of age story as well. So what is it about that story format, I guess, that, brings you back to it?
Well, at the risk of making, taking this in a sad or dark direction, we've chatted before, and that I have a lot of trauma in my background and a lot of depression in my background, and so I think some of that finding yourself that other people perhaps, and maybe we all just imagine, but that perhaps other people went through in their teenage years, I couldn't resolve a lot of those questions. There wasn't really a word for, I'm not saying that there wasn't at all a word for my identity, but I wasn't aware of the discourse around, for instance, being non-binary. And it's not just about that, but it's also just in terms of, in a lot of ways, it feels like my childhood kind of was put on hold, and I had to kind of seek out those experiences, those defining experiences later. I'm not sure if I'm rambling or if I make sense.
No, I'm with you.
Yeah. And so I guess I haven't lost my fascination for those questions of identity and for those questions of belonging, because it took me a little bit longer to figure out where I belonged. And I'm not sure I'm done yet, but it has taken me longer.
It is the kind of thing, I think, that if there's one thing about the coming of age story being so much about a young person, right? Like, and, I don't mean this at all as a criticism of this story, because I think it works really beautifully. If there's one thing that I do kind of feel like that story format sort of, we have this cultural understanding of that story, of the portrait of the artist as a young man or whatever, right? But the story ends at the, beginning of that character's adulthood. And I think that, there is something about the way that we sort of mythologize that I think we can forget the fact that like your life doesn't end when you're done being a teenager, and these sort of questions of who am I, and where do I fit in, and all of these things. These are lifelong questions. And I actually think this ties into the story here pretty well, because in a typical coming of age story, the elder figure would be a mentor for the young protagonist, right? Whereas here, and I think that, even with these things about, a ghost story of coming back to finish things up, oftentimes if there's a ghost figure and a young protagonist, it would be a similar thing where, you have this sort of magical mentor figure. But here it's really more the other way around, that Ignacio is not the one who has the wisdom to impart. And even though he is past the end of his actual corporeal life, he still has a lot of learning and growing left to do as well. You know what I mean?
Let me make sure I don't miss the opportunity to say that I absolutely love that framing of this as a coming of age story for Ignacio. That is, I love it.
Thank you.
So I think that a lot of times the reason maybe I have a lot of thoughts, so let me see if I can try to remember them all. I realized halfway after we started that I was a fool for not having put a pad of paper next to myself. But I think that framing tends to occur because we look just in general, traditionally at external markers of passing from one era of life to another. So, leaving school, getting married, then you've left childhood and you've entered adulthood. But once you are married, maybe have kids, maybe have a house, you have a job, then there isn't a big external signpost until you retire. And so if we
until you get that senior citizen discount.
Yes, until the first time somebody calls you sir. Yeah. As they hold open a door for you. And so I think that kind of leads us to think that those stories are stories that belong at the end of adolescence. But yeah, you can come of age at any point. But I guess because stories always have something external as well as the internal, you got to figure out what the threshold is to make the reader, to signal to the reader, So yeah, Ignacio's threshold is that he's dead. I'm trying to imagine how to construct a coming of age story. Maybe that's why we get so many literary stories of people in midlife who have affairs.
Yeah. It's kind of funny to put that in the same frame.
Yeah. Well, it's, some author trying desperately to recapture that same sense of threshold. Maybe. And not in a good way, but Benny, it's interesting because Ignacio thinks that he's there to be Benny's mentor, but he's mentoring him with terrible advice. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, Benny doesn't, come with wisdom. He has a lot of questions and doubts, but I think Benny is really good at listening to everybody, including to Ignacio's bad advice, but to all the folks around him and eventually figuring out what to discard, but also, taking good advice from his parents, from Andrea, from his siblings, from the psychologist, from teachers.
Yeah, there are other mentor figures around. Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of interesting because, this age range, we're talking about, early adolescence, right? Mm-hmm. It's such a fraught one, I think, for a lot of people just in their lives. Like when you think about this times in your life when that were maybe the most traumatic, a lot of people, it's this age, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that literature really gives us the opportunity for is that at that age, we're sort of struggling between this transition between childhood and whatever comes after. And, we're trying to individuate ourselves and we're trying to exercise some form of agency over our lives while at the same time still being very dependent on our parents and on these mentor figures. I think that there is something about that sort of inherently provides. We were talking about tension before, but that is sort of like the tension of human nature, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I don't know if that was really a question. But, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And he's got distributed mentorship.
Yeah. Another thing that I was thinking about with this story is that some of the themes that you're working with here are ones that are actually fairly heavy, and they're ones that you don't ever really get past in your life. You don't really get to a point in your life where these things are over. This idea of loss, of closure, of forgiveness. Particularly, I'm thinking about Benny's dad's relationship with his own father, Benny's grandmother's relationship with Ignacio. I think that these characters here are given these moments of grace. And of course, having a literal ghost be able to show up and talk to you is the kind of thing that I think a lot of us wish that we could have. But I think the idea of what does it mean to forgive someone? What does it mean to feel a sense of closure, either in your life or with someone who is no longer part of your life? Those are things that are going to come up in everyone's life, sometimes early, sometimes later, but often many times throughout your life. And I know you're a parent, your kids are older than mine. My oldest is 15, my youngest is 9. And there is, I think, a way in which, as parents, it's sort of the most natural thing in the world to want to protect your children, right? Mm-hmm. But also there's a recognition that like everybody has to go through some of these emotional experiences in life. And I don't know, I think there's something about, as a writer, approaching these topics, you know, putting these things into a story, but doing it in a way that feels age appropriate, that feels very similar to the kinds of things that come up for me as a parent, you know? And I guess I was sort of wondering how you thought about that with this story.
So are you wondering how I think about it in terms of responsibility to the audience, or just as like from a craft perspective?
Well, I mean, really both, right? Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, on one level, I mean, you know, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of this conversation was just the difference between writing for younger readers versus writing for older readers. And I think that, you know, sort of what I was hearing from you is that in a lot of ways, you're not really making a huge differentiation there, that like the story kind of is the story, right? And so you need to do what serves the story, you know. So from a craft perspective, there's that, right? But I also do think that, I mean, I know you're a thoughtful person. And so, I mean, even just something like reading the author's note, the acknowledgments, and the little, the advanced copy that I read came with a little like author's forward kind of letter. And in that there is sort of an acknowledgement of like, you know, what you hope your readers might take away from a story like this. So it's also got to be, I mean, it's apparent that you're not entirely just thinking about the story as story, but also a story as something that somebody's going to read, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I promise I think this is going to lead somewhere eventually. But so I've been a little bit nervous about my impending first appearances other than the book launch, because the book launch, the only thing I feel about that that's weird is that virtually everybody who has told me that they are coming is an adult, is, you know, 25 years or older. And this is a book for middle grade readers, but it's my friends, you know, who are coming, and sometimes they're bringing their kids. And I'm peripherally aware that there will be other folks there who are just interested in, hey, this is a book launch. You know, I know that the bookstore is itself doing a little bit of promotion for it. And I know that some people are expressly pointing it out to kids at the local schools and stuff like that. The very next weekend, I have an event with the local Girl Scout troop. And I've been conscious of the fact and nervous of the fact that it's been a long time since I've actually taught kids of that age or worked with kids of that age, or really had a lot of exposure. And that's a maybe a dicey thing to be admitting as a middle grade writer. I have taught middle grades. I've taught sixth grade, and I have been a summer camp counselor, but I've been in high school for the last, 21 years. So once upon a time, I was really good at it, though. I remember that. You know, I remember when I was a counselor at a summer camp for boys, that I was placed in charge of the youngest kids, and people, you know, used to say to me, oh, wow, we've had a lot less homesickness. We've had a lot more kind of functionality from that age range than we had before. And I felt like that was a strength of mine. And it's been a long time since I've exercised that muscle. And this is going to sound like a cliche, but I think it kind of ties into my approach in writing the book and what I'm going to have to do when it's time for me to talk to a room full of 10-year-olds. And that is, other than watching my language or not talking about things that parents will want to talk about with their own kids directly, I don't know a different way to talk to people. I'm going to talk to all people the same way. I talk to kids with the full respect that I have for any other human being. And that's how I write also. And I will have my critique partners who will say, this word you just used, your readers are not going to know this word, or this slang you just used is very out of date, or something like that, So I do have people, certainly not dumbing down the words, by the way, just to be clear. I mean more having my voice be, having Benny sound like who he's supposed to sound like. But I think when it, to your question and callback to the writing for younger kids, it's basically I'm just writing for myself, really, and writing the same way. I feel like it's a fantastic time for middle grade fiction from my reading. 10, 15 years ago, I didn't really enjoy as much of the middle grade fiction that I would read as I do now. And I felt like middle grade fiction, I don't want to put too discrete a line on it because I don't want to be calling out specific authors, but there was a time in my life where I would read middle grade as well as, if a book was popular, as well as young adult, as well as adult. And I tended to find middle grade books often twee and didactic. And the books that I'm seeing published now, I don't feel that way about. They're grappling with some of these same questions about identity, or about where do I get my good advice from, or how do I figure out how to be, but not from the standpoint of, here are the answers, but here are a bunch of attempts to grapple, and we'll just see what we learn together. And I don't know that I could have successfully written middle grade 20 years ago, but I feel like the market has moved in a direction where it has dovetailed a little bit, or maybe not dovetailed, but it's come into a place that's more adjacent to what I'm prone to do anyway.
I think that there is just sort of generally a growing awareness among not just writers or publishers, but just people in general, that children have a much more complex internal life than the way adults have traditionally thought of them.
And some people, because we're also seeing in the news a lot of people trying hard to push back against that.
Right. But I would say, and as much as it's absolutely awful, so many of the things that are happening, the way that young people, and particularly queer young people, are under attack in this country, I think the argument could be made that backlash wouldn't exist without the growing awareness, So as much as that backlash is a terrible, awful thing, I do feel like there is, obviously it's not universal. Obviously we're not there yet, right? And this is how it is for kind of everything, right? But I just feel like there is more awareness about a lot of these kinds of things, whether that might be race or gender or sexuality or religion or ethnicity or age, like, thinking about how kids exist in the world as complex intellectual and emotional beings in their own right.
Yeah. So my favorite author is Amy S. King. She's a young adult and now middle grade author. And she just shared something on Instagram within the last day or so that really dovetails with this. And I'm not going to go digging for it to quote it directly, but it was a response to a letter that she received from, I think, a young aspiring writer. And it was, I guess, acknowledging the fact that the folks who are trying to limit the availability of marginalized kids to see themselves in fiction, they believe that they are protecting kids, and that they are protecting kids from being exposed, I guess, to things that they're not ready for, maybe, or being exposed to sin, maybe, I don't know. But that in fact, they are harming those kids because those kids are not queer because they read it in a book. They're queer and they're looking for themselves. They're marginalized in whatever other way they're marginalized, and they're trying to figure out if there's a place for them within this society that they are in. And we're just denying them, not we, but
Yeah.
There are folks who would deny them the ability to see themselves out of a misguided belief that they're protecting, and they're not the ones protecting. They're the ones doing the harm. And I mean, obviously, this. I'm not preaching to you, but I just thought it was a very well put way of acknowledging that.
Yeah. And I do feel like, just in general, whether it's middle grade or young adult, there have been so many times over the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years where I have thought, gosh, I never had books like this when I was a kid, and I really wish that I did.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that, when I was a kid, there were many books that I loved. And in a lot of ways, I don't know that it was something that I even realized that I was missing, that, for example, and I've said this on the podcast so many times, but, the first time I'd ever seen certain aspects of my experience as an Asian American depicted in a book was when I read Celeste Ng's debut novel, which I was like 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't realized at that point how moving that was, and how, I'd always considered myself such a reader, and there were many characters who are either white or white coded that I did identify very strongly with when I was young, but just, I didn't know to think, oh, I was missing this, because it just wasn't available. And I do feel like literature has come a long way in the past 40 years.
And it's interesting because I think about some of the things that I read as an adolescent. And the one thing with my parents, there's a lot of decisions they made that I don't think were good decisions, but they were very open to letting me read anything that I wanted to. Some people might argue, actually to a fault. I actually don't think so, but there are things that did exist that I did read that would roll the socks down of some of these crusaders, and they were freely available and not a problem, but they also were not showing me myself on the page. They were not giving me that sense of there is a space for me, and this is how to approach it. They were just problematic. And that was okay, but it's only a problem when it makes a marginalized kid think that they deserve to be who they are.
Yeah. It is a wild time to be alive.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I suppose, there are perhaps limits to what books can accomplish, but I do feel like, to me, it is just really fascinating that I feel like there has never been a time, at least in my life, where literature of all sorts, but particularly literature for young people, has been as diverse in so many ways as it is now. And so even though there are a lot of really terrifying things happening in the world, there are also some really amazing and beautiful things happening as well, So I think we should take a little break here and then come back and do the second segment.
All right. Sounds good.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So I didn't mean to steer the first half of our conversation right at this topic, but I feel like we kind of have. And I'm interested in the idea of empathy, but specifically, how do we create it in people, both when we're talking about in our own children, the children that we raise or the children that we teach, but also the adults that are passing some of these laws or voting for some of these politicians, the adults that, from my perspective, it feels like they're lacking it. I see a lot of times, a lot of folks who are politically in a similar place to me, holding a very strident line, and I respect where they're coming from, but where they say, look, you need to, shunning is the only thing that works, but it doesn't, of course, because these folks have their own social circles. They don't need us. And how does anybody come around? I look in my past and I see the places where my own perspective of things has changed, and the places where I was less empathetic, and somebody got me to re-examine, my views. I'm just curious to figure out, we have this truism that reading books makes you more empathetic. But I know plenty of really well-read people who come down on positions that I find horrifying. And we have this idea that being more educated maybe makes you more empathetic. But the same thing, I know really educated and really intelligent people who somehow end up with perspectives on genocide or on queer children or on education that I find horrifying.
Yeah. I think what it is for me, and one of the reasons why education is such a locus for the culture wars, right, is, kind of what it comes down to is that my experience of people is that we have a tremendous capacity for self-deception when it is emotionally convenient. That, for me, the biggest driver of what I would call evil in the world is not greed or things like that. It's the inability to tolerate any amount of emotional discomfort. And I do think that there is a way in which like I was saying, why education is such an important focus right now is because it's only with, having enough education about what our actual history is, and not just the history that makes us feel good about ourselves as individuals or as a nation, right? That we can have any kind of context for what's happening now. But the difficulty, of course, is that for a lot of people, learning that history is extremely emotionally uncomfortable. And so they'd rather deal with it by, saying, oh, this is lies, or, you shouldn't be able to say these things in school, than to actually grapple with, what does it mean? This is the truth. And what does that mean about me? And what does that mean about people like me? And what does that mean about the history that, brought me and other people to the place where we are now? It's very challenging,
Yeah. Right away, I really appreciate that, because I hadn't thought of the ability to sit with emotional discomfort as a core skill.
It's something we're not taught how to do in school, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, honestly, just the moment you said that, it felt like a light bulb went off in my head. Because it's one of the things that really frustrates me with some of the people, because we all exist in multiple settings. Maybe there are people, I'm sure there are people who, you're an artist and that's all that you are, like everything. That's not all in a limiting way, but that's everything that you are, is an artist. And so you get to be in that space 100% of the time. I am a teacher beholden to folks who are not me. And I am also a person who lives on the boundary between a somewhat urban and a somewhat rural area. And I have people in my life with very different perspectives on things. Some that are, again, deeply troubling, but that I can't just go around saying, well, you can't be a part of my life. That doesn't mean being dishonest about my beliefs or anything like that. But so that idea of something that we could bring up our kids with, it's okay to just grapple with that discomfort. And I look at the places in my life that have taught me that that's okay. Like in reverse chronological order, as artists that I've loved have become problematic, I've had to grapple with, I love this work of art. I have loved this creator. And now this creator is horrible in ways that I didn't know they were horrible. And now when I go back and look at this work, I see horrible things in this work that I didn't know were there, but I still feel love for this work. I still, this creator was formative for me. And I see some people just have a really hard time sitting with that. Like, no, you can't call an artist problematic. You're just going to call everything problematic. Or if you are you saying that I can't still have my connection to it? And I think it's a necessary skill to be able to sit with something in your life and say, this is meaningful to me, and it's also imperfect and problematic, and just kind of inhabit that discomfort.
Yeah. I think that there is a way in which, I do not want to equate the progressive versus the reactionary sides of our political spectrum, because they're not the same. I mean, just to be clear for anyone who's listening, right? Trying to pass laws to exterminate people or to suppress people's rights is not the same thing as, shouting people down from the left. Yeah. It's just not the same.
And I worry that if I'm not clear on that.
No. You're coming across 100% clear to me. I just want to make sure that anybody who's listening, right?
Yeah.
Because what I'm about to say is that this inability to sit with discomfort, this inability to hold more than one thing in your head at the same time is not limited to one side of the political spectrum. For example, I have an uncle who I love, who has been part of my life for my entire life, and who has, many of my most meaningful memories from my childhood, whether it was holidays or family trips or going over to my aunt and uncle's house to play with my cousins. He's a part of my life, right? He has political beliefs that are absolutely abhorrent to me. And that's not something that it wasn't as apparent when I was young. And also I was more ignorant when I was young. But as I've gotten older, and especially with the rise of Trump, that is something that just has come out, and so there are a lot of people, as you mentioned, who would say, you should cut that guy out of your life. And I think that is, for some people, that is going to be the right thing to do.
Yes.
For some people, that is going to be the only thing to do in order to ensure their own either physical or emotional safety. And I 100% get that. But I also think for a lot of us, these things are not clean. And I think that there is a tendency on, it's not a political thing where like one side is able to handle nuance and the other is not. I think that just in general, our culture wants things to be clean. Yeah. And there's not a lot of recognition that these things are just not clean, so there are ways in which my uncle knows how I feel about his beliefs, because we've gotten into it before. And we've sort of reached a certain detente at this point where, he won't bring up his shit when we're at Thanksgiving, and I won't bring up my shit at Thanksgiving, and we'll be able to have a nice time, because at the end of the day, we love each other. There is a certain respect that has to be mutual on that level. And I know many people, their problematic uncle won't show them that respect. So I get this is a different situation than what a lot of people are dealing with.
And I think it would be reductivist to just listen and say, oh, well, here's a couple of pretty privileged people just whining about how they want to hold on to their problematic friends. But I think about, again, the ways that I've come around, and I also think about the ways where I have not been, like you said, not been able to be the one to do that work for somebody. I've talked about this on social media where somebody wants to just ask questions, but it's in bad faith, and they're not just asking questions. And I've wrestled with I am relatively privileged, and so I could do the labor, but how many times can I do the labor, and where do I decide that the ask is in bad faith, But on the other hand, somebody like your uncle, sometimes it's not the arguments that bring somebody around. It's the cognitive dissonance, like you say, of holding on to multiple things, from his perspective of, I love Mike, and Mike believes these things that I strongly disagree with. And how do I hold those things? So maybe we're causing cognitive dissonance in somebody else at the same time as we're experiencing it ourselves.
Yeah. As I think that I was, heavily involved with activism for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, and this is something that I never had the energy for, but I remember, this was probably around like 2018 or so. I remember hearing about people who were trying to do this work of convincing people. And there are a lot of people who are going to say, you know what, in terms of political organizing, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck. It's just a waste of time to try and convince people to switch teams. And there is a pragmatic truth to that like you're going to probably, in terms of trying to organize a movement, you're going to get more results by motivating people who already agree with you to action rather than trying to convince somebody to switch teams. I think that's true. But what was really interesting to me is I would see these videos and stories and seminars and stuff about these people who were trying to do this work of trying to just, get their foot in the door, make a little bit of a crack in the wall, and what I heard over and over again is that it is stories that do this, that you have to be able to approach people not from the standpoint of, I'm going to try and get you to change your mind, but it's just, let's spend a little time together. I want you to hear my story and you can do with it whatever you want. And that when people are able to meet on that level, which a lot of times they're not, but that I would see these people have successes in this way. Maybe it's not scalable to a movement, but on an individual level, even with strangers, of being able to just, going door to door, knocking on people's doors and having conversations that it doesn't change someone's mind overnight. It's not a one and done kind of thing, but that it just introduces a little bit of doubt in that person's mind and a little bit of human connection. And I don't know if literature or art can do that as well. I'd like to think it can. That's the overwhelming thing that I was told over and over again, and which I would see in these activist spaces, is that it is ultimately the storytelling that brings that point of connection.
And, when you have somebody in your life and you start to see it, and I know this is sounding simplistic, but I think back, and I'm going to try to be vague just in case, because I don't know who might know me in my life and hear themselves in this story. But I think of somebody in my life who has not very progressive views, and a mutual acquaintance of us both who is gay and really not particularly disguised, but this Trump-leaning acquaintance of mine hadn't pieced it together somehow. And one day I heard him just kind of have this epiphany. He goes, you know what? So-and-so is gay. And that's all right. And that shock of, that's all right. And I was like, holy shit, I'm glad I got to see that moment. And he didn't become a progressive after that. That would be, but maybe that's a chink in the armor,
Yeah. I think about, my older brother, for example. He's the kind of person who does want to get in arguments with people about stuff. And my grandmother, our grandmother, she is a little old lady, and, like a lot of people of her age, especially Japanese American people of her age, that had some pretty regressive views about Black people and about people of other religions, and she was afraid of Barack Obama, and which on a lot of levels is a ridiculous thing, but he worked on her for years and was able to convince her not to vote for Donald Trump. So that's something. These things can happen. And another thing, sort of to a point you were making before, is that when I think about my own development as a moral being, I know that there are things actually you and I have known each other a long time at this point, like more than 20 years. There are times in our shared history, which maybe you would have even seen play out on social media or on like the web forum or something, that I had some pretty, I would always think of myself as an open-minded and progressive guy, but there were things that I was just ignorant of when it came to.
I could say the same.
Things about people of other races, people of other genders, particularly things about women that, when I was, let's see, when we first met, I would have been 24 years old. At 24, there was a lot of really shitty stuff that I thought about women, not realizing that it was shitty. Yeah. And I'm honestly not sure how I made the leap. I know that it was at least in part to being exposed to other perspectives, to women's perspectives or Black people's perspectives or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't know exactly how I got to the point where I was able to internalize those things. But I do know that if it hadn't been for the fact that at least a few people were willing to take a chance on me, I don't know if I would have gotten there, or at least I wouldn't have gotten there as early as I did, which is to say maybe it was late, but it was earlier than now, right.
Yeah. And I want to keep reiterating that can't be a responsibility that we put on marginalized people. Of course. But, it's good when there's somebody who can do that work.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. I'm not a white person, and there are times when I get really tired of trying to explain Asian American stuff to white people, or even to, non-Asian people of color sometimes.
Yeah.
I get tired sometimes. I don't want to have to deal with it sometimes. But I don't, to put it bluntly, I don't trust white people to do that for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it
is kind of a weird double bind.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. That's the space I'm living in, because I don't have the energy to just debate with somebody whether my gender is a real thing or just some weird figment of my imagination. But yeah, if I listen to cisgender people, there will be times when I just wince a little bit, but I guess it can bring people a little bit closer, when somebody well-meaning else does it. I don't know.
Yeah. There are times when, it's good allyship is important for sure. Solidarity is important. I do sometimes think that there are some things that, within our own communities, we can kind of only trust our people within that community to do certain kinds of work. But, at the same time, I've had conversations with people that say, well, like, why bother trying to convince people not to be racist? Like, the work it shouldn't be convincing people not to be racist or homophobic or transphobic or whatever. The work should be, empowering your own community so that it doesn't matter if people are bigoted. And, that's a perspective that I understand. And I definitely see the sort of practical point that's being made. Mm-hmm. But I also feel, I just feel so grateful that I've had the opportunity to learn things. And I guess I don't want to give up on people entirely. I don't know.
A thing that frustrates me, circling back to really the first point you made, is I'm just pivoting a little bit here, but I've been thinking about that during this whole conversation. And I am not Christian in any way, shape, or form, but I was raised Christian. I was raised Catholic. And that ability to sit with uncomfortable history and facts is something that I felt that I was explicitly taught by my Catholicism. The idea that we are all imperfect, and that doesn't make it okay to not try to get better, but we are all imperfect and we are all sinners, and we all can also look back at those who came before us, and they were imperfect and they were sinners, and horrible things have historically been done, and we can try to make good for that, but we sit with an awareness of those things. And so that's where it's so frustrating to me, watching a certain segment of Christianity. It seems like push the exact opposite message. It's just weird to me that my progressivism has as its roots something that a lot of reactionary folks are pointing at as the justification or the reason for their stance.
Yeah. I've seen people talking today about how, oh gosh, I don't know if this is like memes or what, but just, talking about how certain right-wing Christians in America now are going so far as to reject actually Jesus just in general, because he doesn't align politically. And it is just a wild.
Yeah, that guy's a socialist for sure.
It is a wild thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think that all of these questions, right, there's the level of political efficacy, which is an important one. And I'm glad that there are people doing that work. And I'm glad that I did that work for a time as well. And then there's the level of individual people's lives. And we all have to make a certain calculus of how much energy do I have? How much can I emotionally tolerate? We all have our limits. We all have our own priorities and have to decide, who are the people that I'm going to cut off? Who are the people that I'm going to bring in? Who are the people that I'm going to have sort of an uneasy tension with maybe forever? We all make these decisions. And I don't know, for me, I think that there is, and this is another thing that is, again, it's neither a left nor right thing, but we have a tendency to think about things in terms of ideas and ideology rather than humanity and human relationships. And for me, it's just, the ideas are important, and the ideas also represent things that are tangible in human life, things like autonomy, things like tolerance, things like liberation. These are all things that are tangible and material in people's real lives. And I get that. But I just also think that we can get real caught up sometimes in rhetoric. And at the end of the day, we all are just living our lives on an individual basis. We are all living our lives, yes, as part of a community, but that's relationships, right? Like, and that those things are important too. I want to be careful and say, I'm not trying to say we don't need the kinds of flame-throwing rhetoric that sometimes, a lot of that has a lot of utility. Sometimes it's really necessary. And I think this is a time when we're seeing that these things are really necessary. And that making a lot of noise on issues can move the needle in some ways, maybe not as much as we want, and maybe not as fast as we want, but we can see these things having results. And I get that. And I believe in that. But I also, sometimes I just feel like, here's what it is. This show is ostensibly conversations about art, right? And that's two things. It's art and it's conversations. And there is something uniquely human about art and uniquely human about conversation, I think. And I'm not going to try and say that I think that a show like mine with, a smaller reach as it has is changing the world or anything like that. But I think that for me, this recognition of mutual humanity is integral to what I'm trying to do with the show and what I appreciate about art. And I think that is something that needs to be, at least in my conception of the world, it needs to be part of the world also, Yeah.
And I think it's, thinking about, the so-and-so's gay, but that's all right. To the extent that it's safe to do so, and it's not equally safe, and it's even for one individual, it's not equally safe everywhere, but to the extent that it's safe to do so, I think it's worthwhile for us to live our lives as loudly as possible. Not only marginalize people, but, everybody, but so that, if you've got that person who might eventually come to see people like you that they don't know as being equally human to you that they do know, they have to see that commonality between you, their friend or their relative, and the other that they don't know at all, And, again, granted, it's not always safe to be open. And I'm not only talking about marginalization, I'm talking about also progressive stances. I'm talking about activism. I'm talking about all of those things.
Yeah. We all have our own calculations that we have to make about what is and isn't safe and what we do and don't have the capacity for. And it's going to look different for different people, but,
right.
But
I'm saying, like, I can have somebody in my life where, okay, I'm not arguing with you right now because I don't have the bandwidth and because I don't believe it's going to accomplish anything and because I don't think your questions are in good faith. But you know who I am. You know where I stand. And so just my presence in your life is an argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is what I'm kind of going for there.
Yeah. And I'm glad that there are people out there who can be loud in the ways that they're loud. I'm glad that there are people who can be confrontational, and I'm also glad that there are people who can be more subversive, maybe, or more calling people in instead of just calling people out. I think that there's room for all of it. Yeah. So the last question that I like to wrap up with is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
So the answer that I was prepared to give is still my answer, but it's not something I've read very recently, but in the last year and a half, couple years, is Light from Uncommon Stars by Raika Aoki.
Oh, yeah.
That book just blew me away. Very powerful book, often a funny book, and a book that, like Psalm for the Wild Built, really just challenged a lot of my preconceptions about how writing is done, how art is done. So that's a fantastic book. But I'm going to cheat and piggyback a second one because of our conversation about the book banning and censorship, and that is the middle grade book Attack of the Black Rectangles by Amy S. King, which is a middle grade book that deals head on with the idea of book banning in schools, and not only book banning, but just the way that we attempt to treat kids like they have to be protected from ideas rather than helped to engage with ideas. And predictably, that book has been banned and challenged in counties, districts all over the country.
Yeah.
But it's if you haven't read Amy King and you like middle grade, then that could be a nice entry point.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And thanks for talking with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on. And conversations with you are always fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase your own copy of Benny Ramirez and the Nearly Departed. If you're listening to this episode on the day it releases, then that book will be coming out next week on Tuesday, and you can pre-order it at any of those links. I've also included a link to Jose's website where you can find a full bibliography of their work, including links to stories that are available online. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you get your podcasts. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with a new episode, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.